Brandon Stover, our next speaker, is a PhD student in ethnomusicology at the University of Colorado Boulder. He received his master's in arts in 2015 in ethnomusicology as well from Goldsmiths, University of London, and his Bachelor of Music in Music Education from Millikan University. His research focuses on the Japanese shakuhachi and the spread of tradition outside of Japan. As a shakuhachi practitioner, he has traveled around the United States and Europe, researching the roles that gender and digital space play in continuing the tradition of the instrument.
Hello all, and thank you to Dr. Thomas and everyone else who has put today's symposium on and as well organized this journal. Today I would like to talk about the physicality of language acquisition and identity performance. While my particular research lies a bit outside of the Americas, it can be very applicable as I study Japanese music practices worldwide, not just in Japan. So the topic about which I am speaking today might be applicable to any language, culture, or performance group, especially those learning new languages or those who perform in multiple languages. I'm interested in how the process of crossing the boundary between being monolingual and bilingual reveals a change within our own bodies and the materiality of our voices, especially for singers who do so often in performance settings. When learning a new language, students must learn a new cognitive structure as well as new physicality required for phoneme production. How a person produces a sound is so ingrained in the body that difficulty arises in the act of physically making unfamiliar combinations of sounds. Different languages make varied use of the oral cavity, teeth, tongue, lips, and facial muscles in producing a wide range of sounds. It takes practice and a fair amount of cognitive effort to switch between what Beatrice Honickman calls articulatory settings, or the physical makeup of language in the oral cavity, the boundaries between two different languages. How then does speaking or singing in a foreign language affect the materiality of the voice, as well as the cognitive process of the performer and the listener? How does one traverse the language divide of multiple vocalities in the early stages of language learning and development? By examining these questions, one can see that each body has the potential for not only multiple voices, but also multiple grains within those voices. Roland Barthes defines the grain of as the materiality of the body speaking its mother tongue. That is, how the body is encoded in the audio signal. Grain, unlike language, does not carry meaning. However, it is full of information. We must recognize such aspects, or we may recognize such aspects as age, gender, size, among many others from the audio signal. The grain and materiality of the voice helps us to determine something about the body from which the sound emanated. And while Barth's concept of grain dominates voice studies, perhaps his idea need not be confined to the mother tongue. I propose that when performing in a foreign language, vocalists express a dual materiality, or what I call a Dopple-Grain, an alternative grain that carries remnants of the physicality of our native voice, but is unique in its physical production and performance of foreign languages, which demarcates new ways of thinking about and expressing identity in both performer and listener. Performing in a foreign language involves more than just understanding new vocabulary and grammar structure. The physical placement and materiality of phonemes alters our perception and usage of language. Speaking and performing in a foreign language requires crossing language boundaries and inhabiting both native and foreign physical and material linguistic locales. Though through language learning and production, one embodies the new language and finds a way to make performing pleasurable. Not only that, but the new language production becomes a characteristic of the vocalizer. We are recognized by others by our voice, and our voice is one way we are able to express our thoughts, feelings, and emotions to others. When we learn a new language, we also learn a new way of being and expressing. Kreeman and Seditz point to the voice as an indicator of physical and social characteristics of the speaker, or quote, the sound a particular speaker produces ultimately depends on the physical characteristics of that speaker's sound producing anatomy, end quote. The voice encodes into audio signals the physical body from which it emanates. When we speak, sing, yell, or otherwise vocalize, listeners hear our body in the voice as it sounds. Our grain becomes apparent. Our voice carries part of our bodies with it for the others to hear and experience as well. We tell different voices apart by how body and culture are encoded into the audio of the voice. Physically, different body shapes produce different sounds, while culturally, each culture encourages distinct traits. Barthes heard this enculturated French anatomy in singers when writing The Grain of the Voice. As a native French speaker, the author understood the nuances and materiality of the French language and culture firsthand. Barthes' vocality resonates sympathetically with other French vocalists, hence his clear preference for musical performances of native French performers, such as French singer Charles Panzera, over non-French performers like German singer Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau. Although Barthes enjoys the material sound of native French speakers produce, non-native speakers continue to produce their own type of grain. We are left to wonder then, how does a performance in a foreign language embody grain in the voice, and how does it differ from a native language performance? Is it really as decisive as Barthes claims, or is there space for non-native vocalists to express their identity and Dopple-Grain in musical performance? Our Dopple-Grain is what Mladen Dolar might call a linguistic voice, or what does not contribute to making sense. That is, not the grammar, the vocabulary, or the language of speaking, but the extra sounds that create meaning in our linguistic voice. Such sounds rely on both a producer and a consumer for the voice to convey meaning. As Nina-san Eichheim argues, it is the listener who plays the important role of interpreting the grain of the acousmatic voice from within their cultural upbringing. Physicality and graininess manifest themselves to an extreme degree when we first attempt to sound out new phonemic structures, as the body focuses on the fleshy requirements of production, the extra linguistic material. And I have this firsthand learning Japanese myself, words like shushin, or one that I have to now learn is okonawara. Like, I always trip up over it. So just trying to get the phonemes out is very difficult. The Dopple-Grain begins to take shape as an amalgam with our native grain, but as we become more familiar with foreign languages, the two grains diverge. How we speak, the words we say, and the inflections that we use all play a role in developing our understanding and expression of identity. Listeners, again, might discern body size, gender, nationality, age, or any number of other characteristics from our voice as these manifest as we speak, but they also manifest themselves as we use our Dopple-Grain. This bodily information encoded in the audio signal, however, differs based on the language that the producer is using. In a 2018 study, Tyler Perrachon found that listeners were less able to recognize familiar voices when those voices spoke in foreign languages. Our bodies and our minds change when we speak or listen to foreign languages. Stephen Connor explains it thusly, a quote, "When I change usage, when I speak another language, for example, this mouth changes, the hardware remaining the same, but being transformed by the software. A particular kind of mouth is needed to speak a particular language or dialect. Otherwise, we would not speak of getting your tongue around difficult words. But languages produce different mouths. Each language we learn manifests itself in different ways through our voice and vocal tract," end quote. Language as a software alters our physical hardware, such that each linguistic vocality requires a collection of different physical and material traits. Language defines who we are as individuals. Not only does our audio change when we use different language, but also our identity. As Freya Jarman-Ivens points out, speech brings the being into being. The speaker is more here for speaking, both to the listener and to the speaker. Therefore, when we speak, when speech or language changes, so too does the being making the sound. Speaking in other languages and interacting with others changes our being. How then do we navigate the changes to both physicality and identity when learning or performing in a new language? We do so at first through a process of voice grafting and teacher scaffolding. New language pupils learn the materiality of the language as their teacher speaks it. They embody their teacher's materiality for a short time, copying accents and other nuances. To help students cross the sociolinguistic boundary, teachers provide a scaffold on which language learners graft their own Dopple-Grain. Some of the teacher's materiality in speaking transfers to the student, much like how babies learn speech patterns and accents from their caregivers. The student, when first learning, mimics their teacher's voice, articulation, pitch, and any other discernible factors as exactly as possible. The student attempts to impersonate or become the teacher, or as Laurie Strauss argues, quote, to be inhabited by the teacher, end quote, a sort of ventriloquist act. To better understand the process of moving toward Dopple-Grain formation, Japanese language learners from the United States were asked to comment on developing their Dopple-Grain and identity formation. One common theme which emerged among the participants was their feeling of uneasiness with first learning the new language. When asked the question, when you speak Japanese, does it feel different in your mouth from your native language? One second semester language learner student responded, yes, I feel like my mouth is slow and fat and can't move right to make the right sounds. Early in the language learning process, this respondent noticed not only cognitive differences, but also different physicality of their new language, the new language in their mouth. This respondent reported that their language learning was closely related to the materiality of their teacher, and then that they relied on teacher graft for their language production. Reporting extensive diction practice in Japanese, intermediate language learner Brenna Wider noted in an interview that, quote, Japanese definitely feels different from speaking English. English for me feels more forward in my mouth, whereas I feel like I'm engaging my throat more when speaking Japanese, end quote. Wider has been speaking Japanese for around 7 years, yet is still aware of some physical differences when speaking. She practiced teacher-made drills to become familiar with the physical production of the language, bifurcating her Japanese Dopple-Grain from her English grain through repeated practice and teacher scaffolding. Wider also shared in the interview how her friends noticed a change in her mannerisms during her learning process. She said, quote, when I speak Japanese, my speech is more breathy, my cadence is very different, and I purse my lips more, end quote. This fact was confirmed by her friends reporting seeing a difference in her mannerisms in the way she held herself after returning from a 4-month language study in Japan. Wider noted that when speaking, she bowed her head and upper body more as a result of her studying Japanese. Often coexisting with language learning, cultural learning tends to be a change in the whole body materiality and cognition. One picks up hand gestures, facial expressions, and ways of interacting with others through learning about another culture. Embodied language learning reaches beyond the words in the mouth and becomes a whole body experience. To this one. Associate Professor of Music, singer, and Japanese as a second language learner, Dr. Jay Keister, outlined in an interview his path from uneasiness to fluency. Yeah, he's right here too. So over the past 20 plus years. Shortly after taking Japanese language classes in college, Dr. Keister traveled to Japan for the purpose of studying formal music lessons with Japanese teachers. His voice teacher focused heavily on diction, body posture, and expression, and Dr. Keister recalls the many lessons spent correcting his mouth and vocal tract shape to perfect his Japanese voice. Dr. Keister's performance as a singer allowed him to embody the Japanese language as he learned. Through his learning process, Dr. Keister molded a new sense of self-identity from within the physical formation of his Japanese Dopple-Grain. Because his language learning was connected to music, Dr. Keister noted in the interview that he was, quote, surprised how easy it was to pronounce words in a foreign language when it was musical, end quote. When he's more familiar with the music, the words, he says, just roll out. Dr. Keister admitted that much of his success today was due to his teacher's scaffolding. He said that, quote, when first back from Japan, I was a mini Kiku Oka sensei, his voice teacher. Over time, those things have disappeared. Over the years, I've found my own way of singing it. I'm drawing on embellishments I learned from my sensei, end quote. Dr. Keister's teacher graft is still a part of his Dopple-Grain, but he does not rely on it the same way that early language learners do. Instead, he relies on his own Dopple-Grain to embody Japanese in musical performance.
I sing it wrong now.
He sings it his own way. Although he has been speaking and performing Japanese for over 20 years, Dr. Keister admitted to continued discomfort with speaking Japanese. He acknowledges that singing is much easier to perform than speaking. Singing in a foreign language creates mnemonic points where performers can use the pitch and rhythm to help recall the articulatory settings required to produce the language. Music, in a way, helps to create the bridge over which performers can traverse between cultural and linguistic boundaries. Musical performance also often engages the whole body, and thus it helps the performer to place their body within the sound, to give the sound a grainy materiality. In the published article, I go on to talk about musical performer Kit Ashton, who often performs in multiple languages in one concert. He is the lead singer of the band Bad Lebecs, a Jersey-based, that is Channel Islands, not East Coast Jersey, who has also written his PhD thesis on the intersection of language identity and music among Jerier speakers on the island. In an interview, Ashton spoke of a concert wherein he performed in 8 different languages, leading 5 of them and providing backup vocals in 3 others. He provided an outline of what he was thinking and feeling during this time and how singing in the various languages altered not only his voice, but also his bodily mannerisms on stage, much like Brenna Wider mentioned earlier. However, due to time constraints today, I've left most of this part out of today's presentation. So instead, I will leave you with a few final thoughts. Learning a foreign language bifurcates the grain of our voice, creating a Dopple-Grain. When we learn a new language, we often speak phonemes that at first have no meaning to us. The voice is more present when first learning a new language, yet the materiality is not entirely our own. Rather, it is borrowed materiality in speaking, borrowed from others, our teachers, our other language learners, and from the media that we consume to learn. Eventually, we become comfortable enough with the new language that the phonemes alter the materiality of our own voice when speaking. This materiality, however, is not a permanent change to our native grain, but an alternative Dopple-Grain, which allows us to switch between both voices depending on context. The Dopple-Grain helps us to traverse the boundaries that languages construct between different cultures and groups of people. It also helps us to connect to audience members and other musicians. We are left then to wonder if Roland Barthes would have been satisfied with a non-native French singer who spent many years learning and perfecting his or her Dopple-Grain in French. And if Barthes would not concede, then it never was about the grain or materiality of the voice, but instead about the nationality of the singer. Barthes's grain must not stop at the materiality of the body speaking its mother tongue, but should be redefined as the materiality of the body speaking in any tongue. However, we embody each language individually. We must recognize that our Dopple-Grains coexist with our natural grain when speaking or singing in different languages. Only then can we better understand what it feels like to cross the sociolinguistic border between performing in native and foreign languages. Thank you. Take questions, yes.
So in regard to being bilingual, for example, or just any, research or people that you've interviewed about speaking in multiple languages, where does timbre and pitch come into play? Because I've noticed that even with myself, when I speak in my native language versus a different language, or my 2 native languages versus a different language, I speak at a different, first of all, different volume. I feel like when I speak Spanish, I'm like screaming, but I know that on my family. But also, at a different pitch, and my timbre is different. And I feel like it's almost subconscious. And I don't know if that's part of the language learning process. And if it's something that, for example, that Jay would have, that you would have tried to emulate the learning the language, or it's something that you've come across.
Yeah, so the question for the Zoom people was about timbre, pitch, tone in learning new languages. How does that play in? So yeah, I very much have seen that as well. In my own learning, I'm learning Japanese myself, and just the pitch tends to be higher in Japanese, I think it's all about where the placement is. You get used to placing, maybe, if you're an English native speaker, it gets placed in one place. And then if you learn a new language, in your mouth, like the quote says, it just feels different. And so I think in order to try and separate it in our minds, we try and separate the two different languages. Sometimes we also separate their physicality. So like I'll speak this one here in my throat and I'll speak this one here at the front of my mouth, and so that we don't mix them up. Now that I don't know if that is true for everyone. I haven't gone around and asked, but I found it to be.
Well, gender must play a part because, especially in Japanese, and it's nice that you interviewed Brenna, who's one of our Japanese ensemble students, and she kind of has a lower speaking voice. And did she say anything about her raising her pitch when she speaks Japanese?
Yes. So Brenna, Dr. Kaiser talked about the end issue of gender coming up as well. And she did mention that not only like her mannerisms, but also the pitch tended to be a little higher as well, because that is
That's the way
typical
women are supposed to
Japanese,
speak in Japan. And just to give an example, my wife, who's Japanese, in this country, she's misrecognized because her voice is too high. So someone will call, she picks up the phone, and she says, "Hi." And then they say, "Little girl, is your father at home?" And she got that several times.
Yeah, so it's all very interesting to deal with the kind of how we embody this language. And I can't even imagine singing 8 different languages in one concert,
Right.
and trying to put forward that, this is the language and I'm going to perform as it and sing in it and all this. So.
Thank you so much.